And welcome to the Global Taiwan Institute. My name is Russell Shao. I'm the Executive Director of GTI. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include our Global Taiwan Brief, which is a bi-weekly publication featuring timely analysis and informed opinions about current developments related to Taiwan. Public seminars like the one that you are all participating in here today, discuss timely issues related to Taiwan. We host an annual symposium in the fall featuring practitioners and scholars on U.S.-Taiwan relations and Taiwan's international relations, as well as a number of podcasts. We have 3 podcasts now covering various features of Taiwan-related issues, to include Taiwan Security Review, which is run by our non-resident senior fellow, Alex Gray, our GTI Insights, which is our flagship podcast featuring international perspectives about Taiwan, run by our program manager, Marshall Reed, as well as Taiwan Salon, our newest podcast, which features discussions about cultural diplomacy and soft power issues related to Taiwan. In addition to these programmings, we also provide scholarships and fellowships for researchers and interested individuals to pursue short-term field research in Taiwan and vice versa. For Taiwanese people to come and conduct short-term field research here in the United States as well. So if you're not already subscribed to receive our updates, please do so by visiting our website at www.globaltaiwan.org. Now, I would be remiss if I began today's program without also thanking our co-founders, our board of directors, advisors, and staff and interns who will make all our programs at GTI possible. So thank you all for all your continued support for GTI. Now, so let's begin. I am very pleased to be able to present today's public seminar on implications of global conflict for Taiwan Strait Security. In February of 2022, Russia launched a brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, touching off the largest European ground war since World War II. In doing so, Moscow provoked a profound challenge to the rules-based international order, raised alarms in democratic nations around the world, notably Taiwan and also its close security partner in Asia, Japan. Fears of growing geopolitical instability were further exacerbated more recently by Hamas's October 7th terrorist attack on Israel, which has rapidly expanded in scope and intensity, and despite the current truth, threatens to develop into a far larger regional conflict. For Taiwan and its supporters around the world, these developments have been deeply concerning. While both conflicts are far from the Taiwan Strait, they have nevertheless underscored the fragility of the international system and demonstrated that war remains a viable option for revanchist actors. At the same time, this proliferation of global conflict has placed considerable strain on the United States defense industrial base, calling into question Washington's ability to provide its partners, Ukraine, Israel, including Taiwan, with the armaments that it needs to defend themselves. For Taiwan, the United States, and other like-minded nations and close security partners like Japan, these new conflicts can provide both warnings and lessons. With these wars decide a future contingency in the Taiwan Strait. How have these developments impacted China's strategic thinking? What lessons can Taiwan and its key security partners draw from these conflicts? These are just some of the questions that we will address in today's outstanding panel. Now, allow me to introduce them just briefly in the order in which they will be speaking. First, joining us remotely online is Mike Mazza, who is a senior non-resident fellow here at GTI. He's also a non-resident fellow in foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on U.S. defense policy in the Indo-Pacific, Chinese military modernization, cross-strait relations, Korean Peninsula security, as well as U.S. strategy towards Southeast Asia. Next to my immediate left is Bradley Bowman, who serves as Senior Director of the Center on Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on U.S. defense strategy and policy. Brad has served as National Security Advisor to members of the Senate Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee. He's also, as well as an active duty U.S. Army officer, pilot, as well as an assistant professor at West Point. That's a former. Okay, got it. Okay. Oh my God, that's a lot. Very well. Next to him, we have Alexander Bellin-Green, who is a senior policy advisor at the Heritage Foundation's Center for National Defense. His analysis focuses on defense, deterrence, and alliance management in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. Alex previously served as National Security Advisor to U.S. Senator Josh Hawley. Last but not least, also joining us remotely is Yuki Tatsumi, who's a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the Japan program at the Stimson Center. And before joining Stimson, Yuki worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, among other posts as well. So I've asked each of the panelists to prepare opening comments, hopefully no more than around 10 minutes, on various aspects of the broader issues that we are convening here today to discuss. Following that, I will facilitate a moderated discussion, and with the remaining last 15 minutes of today's session reserved for audience Q&A. So for all our audience members here, both in person, I hope you start preparing your question. We do want to have a engaging discussion here, and also for our online viewers as well. So, and for our online viewers, you may send your questions to contact@globaltaiwan.org, or you may also use the chat function on the YouTube page where you are viewing this live stream now. So with that, let me turn it over to Mike Mazza to help set the scene for us on today's panel discussion on global conflicts and Taiwan Strait Security. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Russell, and thanks to GTI for putting on what I think is a really important and should be a really interesting conversation today. So what I'm going to do with my opening remarks is to hopefully help frame the discussion that will follow. I'm going to more or less keep my discussion at 30,000 feet, perhaps a little bit less than that, describing the multifaceted threats to global order, with a digression to discuss what that order actually is, and how China is responding to and shaping this moment in time. I'm going to largely avoid specific policy debates and policy prescriptions at this point, but I'm certainly happy to get into that during the discussion. So, is the world entering a new age of global disorder? I'd say signs point to yes. The biggest armed conflict in Europe since World War II, a war in the Levant, a short, sharp war in the Central Asian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. These are connected not just by a coincidental moment in time, but by the actors involved. From Russia to Iran to a veritable smorgasbord of terrorist organizations, bad actors have unleashed turmoil through both action and inaction in a swath of territory stretching from Ukraine to Azerbaijan to Yemen. And behind them all stands the People's Republic of China. Beijing has sought to give the appearance of being an independent peacemaker, but the veil it has erected is transparent in nature. It's less interested in peace, stability, and justice for the victims of aggression than it is in fostering a global state of affairs in which China can more easily pursue its own ends. For now, at least, disorder suits Xi Jinping just fine. But let's take a step back for a moment. Is this burgeoning period of global history truly different from what preceded it? After all, there's no period in living memory in which the world can truly be said to have been at peace. Since the close of World War II, for example, the United States has fought wars or engaged in military interventions in East Asia, Southeast Europe, the Middle East, Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America. Insurgencies and civil wars have been regular features across much of the developing world in that time period. Terrorism has been a never-present concern since the 1970s. Ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia and the Rwandan genocide occurred during what might be considered the high water mark of George H.W. Bush's so-called New World Order in the 1990s, and the genocide in Darfur followed not long after. Yet both the Cold War and the post-Cold War eras featured an order of a kind, even if that order was at times quite bloody. Henry Kissinger helpfully defines world order in his book on the topic as the concept held by a region or civilization about the nature of just arrangements and the distribution of power thought to be applicable to the entire world. Whatever the order, its durability depends on its general acceptance or legitimacy and a balance of power that can sustain it. For much of history, orders have been regional rather than worldwide in nature, but that changed beginning in the 19th century when Europe's Westphalian order went global. What is Westphalian order? Again, according to Kissinger, the Westphalian order has relied on a system of independent states refraining from interference in each other's domestic affairs and checking each other's ambitions through a general equilibrium of power. Those fundamental features remain even as the system has evolved. Over the last century, countries have worked together to develop international legal and organizational structures to promote international economic interaction, principles for resolving disputes, and principles for fighting armed conflict when it does break out. Now, arguably, the United States did seek to reshape global order in the wake of the Soviet Union's dissolution. In particular, it aimed to weaken the norm against interfering in the domestic affairs of others, not because it was eager to meddle in the nitty-gritty of foreign political processes, but because it saw the unipolar moment as a moment in which it could finally and wholeheartedly embark on a mission to spread democracy to the furthest reaches of the world. Even so, the basic nature of the Westphalian Order, a system of sovereign states co-equal in status, if not power, remained largely unchanged, despite America's more fulsome embrace of liberal internationalism, and despite movements in some regions, notably Europe, towards supra-regional organization. The Westphalian Order, and especially its modern structures, however, is now under threat. Moscow's and Beijing's imperial pretensions, though distinct, both hearken to earlier eras in which their Russian and Chinese forebears had yet to buy into the Westphalian approach to international organization. The Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the full-scale assault on Ukraine in 2022 all made manifest what Putinistic rhetoric had long espoused, a worldview in which Russian neighbors are not sovereign states properly understood. And Russia arguably now stands at the precipice of a return to the Tsarist approach of nonstop expansion. Whether Russia topples over that edge depends in large part on what happens in Ukraine. China, meanwhile, has long bristled at a world order in which it is supposed to be bound by rules it did not write, and in which it is simply one country among many equals, both in Asia and globally. Beijing has set out to reestablish, I would argue, a Sino-centric order, at least in its own neighborhood and perhaps beyond. Domestic and international economic policy and the Belt and Road Initiative are designed to ensure that all economic roads lead to Beijing. Investments in military power and the increasing use of that power are meant to ensure that Beijing can secure by intimidation and force what foreign economic interests alone do not guarantee, that China and China alone sits atop a new Asian hierarchy in which might makes right, and which the Chinese Communist Party can rule over like a modern-day tributary system. Iran and its axis of resistance, a loose network of state and non-state actors, including Hamas and Hezbollah, have a very different idea of international order, but share with Russia and China opposition to the presiding order today. The goals of Tehran and its proxies in some ways call to mind pre-Westphalian Europe, in which sectarian differences drove interstate conflict. Iran remains committed to quote-unquote exporting the revolution, by which it aims to spread Islam and provide Muslims with the ideological, military, and economic tools to defeat so-called imperialists. And despite Hamas's role as a governing entity in Gaza, its objectives are similarly religious in nature, according to its own covenant. And this is a quote: "Objectives are the fighting against the false, defeating it, and vanquishing it, so that justice could prevail, homelands be retrieved, and from its mosques with the voice of the muezzin emerged declaring the establishment of the State of Islam so that people and things would return each to their right places. Close quote. Russia, China, Iran, the axis of resistance are all then revisionists. They may not agree on what world order should ultimately look like or whether there should even be a world order, but they are united in opposition to the order as it stands. And they're making headway. The world may now be approaching a moment in which, again, to use Kissinger's framing, no single concept of order enjoys widespread legitimacy, and the balance of power that has long upheld the presiding order proves no longer up to the task. At the moment, Russia, Iran, and the axis of resistance are the main antagonists in this assault on global order. All are striving to wipe fellow sovereign states off the map and have strained against or ignored entirely the international legal and organizational structures that Kissinger points to as aimed at curtailing the anarchical nature of the world. Beijing has decided not to stand in their way. And indeed, China has provided arguably modest, but important support for their efforts. Xi Jinping perhaps assesses that once others have done the hard work of tearing down global order, China can swoop in to rebuild order in its own image. In the meantime, Xi Jinping is likely assessing what he can get away with in this incipient age of global disorder. He may already be trying to take advantage, most notably in the South China Sea. The past year has been marked by near unrelenting pressure on the Philippines. That pressure is targeted at the only American treaty ally in the South China Sea with territorial claims is no accident. Beijing is clearly testing the Biden administration at a time when the administration is grappling with other conflicts and has been signaling that it is eager to stabilize U.S.-China relations. Put another way, Xi is testing both the legitimacy of an order in which international differences are supposed to be resolved peacefully, and whether American and allied power is capable of upholding that order. What Xi learns in the South China Sea and from observing American approaches to countering Russia and Iran could prove ominous for Taiwan, Japan, and China's other neighbors in Asia. The United States has crucial, regionally specific interests at stake in both Europe and the Middle East, but it also has a more abstract interest in defending the global order in which it has thrived and under which repeats of the 20th century's most horrifying spasms of bloodletting have been widely avoided. If Washington fails to do so, I think the risk that China will pounce will grow far more acute. And back to you, Russell.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was an excellent scene setter for us here. And I think you make a really critical point there about how these conflicts are interconnected and the regions are increasingly intertwined, and that, and while there are regional specific issues to maintaining order, there is one thread through all of these, which is the magnitude of China's rise and its implications for regional and global order. And I think that really is the heart of the challenge here that we are going to have to try to address in unpacking what will transpire and how to maintain Taiwan Strait Security, which is interconnected to all these issues now. And I'm sure we'll get into a conversation later about priorities and wherewithal and means to be able to match certain ends and how to define those in this global disorder that you have, I think, really painted for us quite excellent in an excellent fashion. Next, let me turn it over to Brad. Brad,
great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Russell. Thanks to everyone here in person and online. Thanks to my panelists. It's real happy to be here. I'm in my comments, I'm going to go from general to specific. So to use Mike's point, I'll start at 30,000 feet, but I'm going to try to get down to 2 or 3 feet by the time I'm done. At our center on military and political power. No problem. Don't leave out the military. Got to connect the two, right, Clausewitz? We try to understand the strategic picture, then also look at the wherewithal to make that policy or strategy a reality. So here we go. Starting at the 30,000 feet of the big picture. I agree with Mike's comments. It is a general assertion that I would say it this way, that this is the most daunting geostrategic landscape that I've seen in my lifetime. I'm a little bit older than I look, so that's a fair amount of time. And And I see increasing security cooperation between our adversaries, between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And I see them more aligned than they've been in decades. Indeed, the US intelligence community in its annual worldwide threat assessment to Congress a few years back said that China and Russia are more aligned than they've been since the 1950s. And at FDD, we've documented a lot of the Chinese-Russian military exercises, naval, land-based, some in China, integrating forces up to the brigade level, Russia sharing best practices from Syria with China, I go on and on. So I think that's a feature of this world that we confront. I will happily jump into policy prescriptions because otherwise, what's the point, right? What's the point? I'm not here to just admire the problems, just talk about what we do about them. So I'm going to intersperse my policy ideas throughout, and I welcome pushback, feedback, but I'm going to try to follow the facts where they lead. And so here goes. I believe U.S. support for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan is a wise and doable investment for the United States, and it's not charity. And I believe we would withdraw it at our own great peril. So now you know my bias, and so here you go. You can listen or not listen. So that's where I stand. Let me just talk about Israel. I'll go Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and then I'll talk a little weapons, right? The wherewithal, and then if you want to go in more detail, I can talk to you about the 15 weapon systems between Taiwan and Ukraine, and demonstrate that those who assert that we can't support Taiwan and Ukraine, those assertions don't withstand scrutiny, by and large. So Israel. What we saw on October 7th, I try to avoid hyperbole. I found that in think tank land, if you use hyperbole, if you exaggerate things, you lose credibility. So when I use terms like evil, I actually mean it, and I use it very deliberately. What we saw on October 7th, I think was the face of evil. If that seems a little harsh to you, spend a little time investigating what happened on October 7th. I'm not going to list what was done to expecting mothers and to women in their homes, and I won't go through all that, but if you think evil sounds too harsh, take a look at what happened. It was the largest slaughter of Jews, single-day slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. The people the Hamas terrorists, not militants who did that, are from the same, I would say, sick ideological stream as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Right? It's no mystery that some of the horrors we saw from ISIS are very much replicating what we saw on October 7th. And a lot of people sitting from afar may not appreciate, I'm a proud American, but I try to understand how our allies and partners are feeling. If you want to kind of get a sense for how Israelis are feeling as I talk with them since October 7th, that was much like for them some combination of Pearl Harbor for Americans and 9/11 all mixed in one. If you look at the 1,200 men, women, and children, elderly and babies slaughtered on October 7th, that would be in per capita terms roughly equivalent to 30,000 Americans being killed on 9/11, more than 13 times that were killed on 9/11. But here's the difference. On 9/11, Al-Qaeda came from Afghanistan, a far, far place. Hamas came from a mile or two away, and they came into the living rooms of these people. Some of the people fled into their bomb shelters. They used Iranian-provided explosives to penetrate the bomb shelters, to go in there and to rape and murder the families hiding inside. I'm sorry to be blunt, but I think sometimes you got to look evil in the face. So that's where Israel stands. And so when I hear people wanting to withdraw support or curtail support from Israel, I don't really understand it, honestly, because not all of America's enemies are Israel's enemies, but all of Israel's enemies are America's enemies. Do you understand what I'm saying? And there's no more capable and motivated partner in the Middle East than Israel going after that subset of American enemies. And as we learned horribly on 9/11, problems in the Middle East don't stay there. And if we have an ally or partner who's willing to fight our common adversaries and is simply asking for the means to defend their homes and the means to have a right to exist, we should provide them those means. And you can hear me reiterate some of those same points when I talk about Ukraine in a moment. So in question and answer, we could talk about Iran's role in this. We could talk about the Ring of Fire, but and I think we can talk about the weapons we provided Israel and how that does or does not overlap with Ukraine and Taiwan. But for the sake of time, I'll move on to Ukraine. You said it, largest invasion since World War II. I think a lot of people in Washington and certainly Western Europe have, they'd never admit it now, but kind of February 24, 2022, kind of had this idea that wars of blatant aggression were kind of a relic of the black and white newsreels of the first half of the 20th century. And newsflash, look at that. Human nature is still human nature. Bullies still exist. There are still terrorists that want to kill us, and they will do it if they have the means to do it. Don't believe me? Look at what's happened in Ukraine since February 24th. And so here I go with my policy prescription. Some people say we can't afford to help Ukraine, and a lot of people paint huge broad brushstrokes. Well, I got some facts for you. Here's some facts. $44.2 billion is what the U.S. has provided to Ukraine security since February 24th, as of November 20th. $44.2 billion. You know how much that is? You say that sounds like a lot, billions of dollars. Compared to what? Compared to what we spent on the Pentagon during the same time period. Did you hear me? What we spent on the Pentagon during the same time period, 21 months. That's 3%. For 3% of what we provided to the Pentagon over the same time period, we're helping Ukraine do what? Deal body blows to the second leading conventional military threat the United States confronts, reducing the likelihood that you'll see aggression against NATO and thereby direct conflict between the US and Russia. And we're sending a very helpful deterrent message to the bullies in Beijing, telling them that America is not neutral if you want to use military force to end freedom among a free people. We're not neutral, and we're going to back it up. That is a bargain. That is an absolute bargain. We can afford it, and we can afford it indefinitely. You want to talk about what's happening on the battlefield? Ukraine is a stalemate, is it not stalemate? Bring it on. We can talk about that. But anyone who suggests we cannot afford Ukraine has not done the math. It's just not true. And by the way, we're doing all that, during the 20 years after 9/11, we heard this ending endless war thing. That was a famous refrain of folks from the Quincy Institute and elsewhere. Well, newsflash, there's not a single American uniformed member fighting in Ukraine right now. So we're getting all those. And by the way, the other benefit of that 3% I talked about, we're doing things in the U.S. defense industrial base. They're going to make us more prepared to deal with aggression in the Taiwan Strait on or about 2027 or 2028. We are, thanks to Putin's deplorable invasion, we're taking steps now. I'm talking multi-year procurement authority. I'm talking increased defense production capacity. I'm talking about more flexible use of presidential drawdown authority. We're doing things now that will put the United States of America in a much, much better position if and when Beijing rolls the dice in the Taiwan Strait in 2027, 2028. Had this deplorable thing not happened, we would have started that the day after the shooting started in the Taiwan Strait. And newsflash, it would have been too late at that point. So thank you for Putin for giving us a horrible, horrible wake-up call that America, what was Churchill's comment? You can rely on Americans to do the right thing after they try everything else. Well, we're finally doing the right thing on our industrial base that's going to put us in a better position. God forbid if Beijing does what we fear they might do in 2027, 2028. Taiwan. I'll speed it up. I got a couple minutes left. Okay. Taiwan. So you think, well, okay, this guy's he's hawkish on Israel, he's hawkish on Ukraine. Where does he stand on Taiwan? China is the number one threat I think Americans confront. Okay, that's where I stand. I'm with my friend Bridge Colby on that. China is absolutely the number one threat we confront. Why do I say that? They have a hostile ideology. I really do view this through a clash of worldviews. To use Mike's term, well, I've been using it for a while, but he said it as well. It's a might makes right authoritarianism. Anyone who's been on a playground, you know what that means, right? I'm stronger than you, so therefore I can take your lunch money. That's what it is. But transpose that into the international, anyone who is anti-oppression or anti-bullying, right? It's not like that on an instinctual level. That's the worldview of Putin, and that's the worldview of Xi Jinping. I'm stronger than you. They want to pick on their neighbors in the South China Sea. What's the biggest obstacle to that? American military power. Push the Americans out, and then you can pick off your weaker neighbors one by one and have your way with them. That's what it is. It's that worldview versus a rules-based international order. Mike said it's abstract. I agree it's abstract when you say it like that. Most Americans start falling asleep when you start talking about rules-based international orders. Like, what does that even mean? But when you talk about what that means in the daily life of Americans, it's not abstract at all, right? In a 30-year period in the first half of the 20th century, more than 500,000 Americans lost their lives in 2 world wars, which especially that we tried to stay out of. So I'm sorry, when you have a thug in Europe trying to redraw international orders with military force, that's not a nice little anomaly we can ignore. And another thing is war is not, we're talking about disorder. Is this a new period of disorder? Well, read history, folks, right? War, sadly, is the norm, not the anomaly. So if we're going into a more cruddy era here, I would say that's a return to the norm and not an anomaly. And, I'm not particularly convinced that Beijing, Tehran, Pyongyang, and Putin are particularly impressed by statements and communiques coming out of the State Department, sadly. I wish they were. That would be nice. It often will come down to hard power. So we have a hostile ideology in Beijing. We have an economy, depending how you measure it, roughly the size of its own. They're investing that wealth. The other countries have some problems right now, but they're investing that wealth in the largest military modernization effort in the history of the People's Republic of China. The more rich Beijing gets, the more they're arming themselves. The more they arm themselves, the more aggressive they're behaving on the border with India, bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death, South China Sea, 9-dash line, all of that, stay out of our water, military exercise in Taiwan Strait, Philippines, Japan. And their military capabilities in some areas are starting to approach those of the United States. So I think the kind of world that my children and, Lord willing, my grandchildren are going to experience in this century is going to be largely impacted by the relationship between the U.S. and China. And I would say the same thing for children in China and children in Taiwan. So, I'm kind of up here talking about weapons and, on a very personal level. We all want our children to have the great lives. We want them to have lives better than us. That kind of world means peace between the US and China. But China's told us what they want to do to Taiwan. They want to end freedom in Taiwan. They've said it. And they'd like to, like you go into Walmart. You want that thing you want on the shelf for the cheapest price possible. They want to pay the cheapest price possible for ending freedom in Taiwan. But if they can't get it through psychological warfare and economic bullying, they're going to do it with military force. They've said so. And by the way, if you read the October November Pentagon report, they're preparing to do so. So in my world, threat is two things. It's will and capability. They told us the will, and they're building the capability. And we can talk about the nuclear element of that if you want to. And they're connecting military exercises closer and closer to Taiwan, directly replicating what a blockade or amphibious invasion would look like. So in my world, it's safe to assume that they actually mean what they say. Iran says, death to Israel. They build a ring of fire to exterminate the state of Israel. Sometimes our adversaries actually mean what they say, as ridiculous as it sounds to us. So prudence is on us to realize that they might mean what to say. So I've gone long, maybe in Q&A. So here's the bottom line on weapons. We've looked at CNPP. We've looked at our the 15 weapons. We've looked at every FMS sale to Taiwan since 2015. And identified 10 major weapon systems that overlap between Taiwan has ordered and has been committed to Ukraine, and 5 additional systems that could potentially be committed to Ukraine. And our research has found that most of, I'm at the 2 to 3 foot. Most of them have zero trade-off with fulfilling Taiwan's orders. A few have minor trade-offs, resulting in less than a 2-year delay, and that aid to Ukraine or Israel hasn't delayed a single Taiwanese order by more than 2 years. In some cases, the money appropriated for aid to Ukraine will actually expedite the delivery of systems to Taiwan, such as HIMARS, or will provide additional capacity to Taiwan decides to order more in the future, including Javelin and Stinger. The large amount of the time that is, so am I saying there's no problems? There's absolutely a problem. The American defense industrial base is under strain. Our production capacity is not what it should be. But I can go down through each one of the 15 weapon systems, and the production capacity is increasing. And where there are delays, by and large, with some exceptions, that is because of existing problems with getting things on contract in the industrial base and cannot be blamed on Ukraine, especially when you're talking about different variant systems. You're looking at presidential drawdown authority, i.e. taking it from existing arsenals versus contracting. That's the kind of nuance that gets lost. And when you get to that level of detail at the 2 to 3 foot level, the argument that the U.S. cannot support Ukraine and Taiwan do not withstand scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett. I think you did a fantastic job there connecting a lot of the dots. Well, the point about the increasing alignment between China and Russia is absolutely I think essential to understanding the nature of the global threats that we face. And to that also the connected nature of these conflicts, not only in terms of how it strains U.S. resources, but to the degree that it actually perhaps in a sort of somewhat counterintuitive way that you highlighted, supports or supports the means by which to expedite some of the capabilities that are that may be necessary to in a Taiwan, more specific to our discussion, a Taiwan contingency. I thought that was a very interesting point that you made, counterintuitive nonetheless. But to the point here, though, I think though we're getting to kind of zero in a bit more now, because now we're talking about somewhat in some of these we're talking about current conflicts, but we're also talking about potential future conflicts. Some these time horizons are varies, and it does sort of raise a question of the need for prioritization, as well as what is now somewhat of an interesting concept that is been floated a bit more about strategic prioritization in order to address the various time horizons of these conflicts that we see, potentially in the Taiwan Strait, conflagration of conflicts in the Middle East, and how that might impact for our conversation, Taiwan Strait Security. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Alex now, because I think Alex will have perhaps another take on some of these issues, and I think that will help to illuminate, I think, the various factors and issues at play here as we sort of map out and address how to deal with all these various problems that we've highlighted already. Alex, over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Russell. And thanks so much, everybody, for being here. I'm grateful for the invitation. I do think it's an important event. I think it's a timely one. I think it's a hard topic. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here to speak with everybody. I will preface by saying that the views I express are my own and do not necessarily reflect any official position of the Heritage Foundation. And with that said, I'd like to use the next few minutes to make three arguments, many of which are going to touch on things that Mike, but especially Brad, was just sort of speaking to. So the first argument is, the severity of the military situation in the Indo-Pacific that Brad described is in many ways, I would argue, understated. I would argue that we are now in a period when Xi Jinping might reasonably conclude that Chinese forces are able to seize control of Taiwan and direct them to do so, unless the United States and Taiwan act decisively now to strengthen deterrence by denial. Second argument is that deterring China will require many of the same capabilities that we have sent to Ukraine, and that because we have a limited number of those capabilities, many of them at least, we can keep sending them to Europe, we can use them to deter China, but we cannot do both under the existing time constraints. This is, obviously, it's basically strictly contradictory to what Brad said. I'm eager to talk more about it. Just from my perspective, in a quick aside, I spent the last several years working this in extreme detail in my role as a national security advisor to a member of the Armed Services Committee, the Senate, with a lot of access to all the posts, for all the programs, for all the information. But you don't need all that. You can see a lot of this in the open source, perhaps using a different methodology than what Brad has talked about. So we can talk about that too, and I will to a certain extent. Third argument that I'll talk about is the United States can and should do everything possible where China was strongly supporting Israel's defense and relying far more on our NATO allies to support Ukraine. In this way, I would argue we can maximize our ability to deter China and deny Beijing's hegemonic ambitions while ensuring Israel has what it needs to defend itself and putting Ukraine on a path to a durable peace. So to my first argument, it is no surprise to anyone that the situation in the Pacific has gotten worse in recent years. China has devoted, as Brad spoke about, substantial resources towards building military capable of invading and seizing control of Taiwan, even in the face of U.S. intervention. And we may be at a point now where it could very well be able to do that. Nobody knows for sure the conditions under which Xi Jinping will feel confident enough to order an invasion, but we do know that the U.S.-China military balance has tilted very significantly in China's direction. We also know that Taiwan still is not ready to defend itself, and we know that things are getting worse. As the commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command testified earlier this year, trends favor China. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means that war in the Pacific is a very real possibility in the next few years. And if it comes, there's a very real chance that China will be able to seize control of Taiwan, even if the United States intervenes to defend Taiwan, unless we act decisively to strengthen deterrence now. Fortunately, I would argue that we can do this by urgently strengthening U.S. and Taiwanese defenses. Our goal should be to convince Xi Jinping not only that an invasion would be terribly costly for the Chinese, but that it will not succeed. This is the essence of deterrence by denial, and it requires substantial investment quickly. Critically, though, this is not just investment in US forces. This is investment in Taiwan's defense, specifically the asymmetric defense capabilities that it requires to delay, degrade, and destroy the Chinese invading force. If Taiwan does not field these capabilities quickly enough, it doesn't do it quickly enough, and even if the United States does intervene, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to save Taiwan. Which brings me to the subject of trade-offs, to the second argument. I would just argue at this point, there really is no question that Ukraine and Taiwan need many of the same weapons. I published a report on this for Heritage, focusing on those overlapping requirements. Rand Corporation has released a report really in a detailed way, helpfully identifying many of Taiwan's requirements. And you can compare all of these to as Brad was describing, the lists of things that we've sent to Ukraine, things that are under consideration to go to Ukraine, and there are other sources as well. Just to give you an idea, here are some of the things both need to defend themselves. HIMARS, attackguns, GIMLRs, howitzers, other precision fires capabilities. You hear about these things a lot in the Ukraine context. Taiwan needs them as well. ASAMs, Patriots, Stingers, other manpads, other air and missile defense systems. Vital to Taiwan's defense. Also vital to Ukraine. Javelins and other anti-armor weapons. In Taiwan's case, to confront Chinese landing forces, because you have to assume they will make landfall, given how badly the military balance is eroded. Harpoons and other anti-ship capabilities. Tactical UAVs for strike and intelligence missions, as well as other enablers. There are other things. Those are the main ones that stand out. And the problem is that the United States does not have enough of many of these things to meet Taiwan's and Ukraine's requirements at the same time. So far, we've prioritized sending these things to Ukraine, but this has drained U.S. stockpiles to the point where we either do not have enough, it appears, to meet Taiwan's requirements, or certainly not enough to do so without endangering our own forces. Might be less of a concern if we were producing new weapons quickly, but we're not. We're not likely to be able to, in many cases, for a number of years, due to our own production constraints and the very slow rate at which we're building our defense industrial base. There is truth to the argument that Ukraine has spurred investments. The payoffs, in many cases, are far less and far slower than anticipated, and we should assume that that will continue to be the case, just as a planning assumption. So the bottom line is Ukraine and Taiwan do need many of the same weapons. Don't have enough for both. And so where trade-offs exist, again, the United States has to choose. We can arm Ukraine or Taiwan. We cannot do both. It is as simple as math. Finally, to the degree there's a silver lining to any of this, is that there are, in fact, and to Brad's points, far fewer areas of overlap between Israel and Taiwan's requirements for U.S. security systems. Both benefit from 155 millimeter rounds, which are in short supply, and that's not nothing, but that is about it, and obviously far more manageable. So what do we do in the face of these clear trade-offs, especially with regard to Ukraine and Taiwan? The easiest option would be to fully support both at the same time, but for the reasons we just discussed, again, I'm eager to discuss them more. The overwhelming evidence is we don't have the ability to do that. So this is not an option. Another option is to focus on what each side needs most. Some have argued, for instance, that we should prioritize Taiwan for certain things, like anti-ship missiles, while prioritizing Ukraine for others. But prioritizing Taiwan in some areas means withholding aid in others. Even if we sent Taiwan anti-ship missiles, for instance, they'd still need air defenses and other things to deter China and defend themselves. So if you want to prioritize defending Taiwan or avoiding war with China altogether, this is not the way to do it. The third option is sequencing. And I think this was some of Brad's recommendation. And if I'm wrong, I'm eager to have that conversation. What sequencing is, in a nutshell, is you focus on one place in time, and then you shift to another over time, right? So Ukraine, then Taiwan in this context. And this seemed to be the Biden administration's preferred strategy, but it's not working. The war in Ukraine is unlikely to end anytime soon. But the threat to Taiwan is increasingly urgent and will only become more so in the next few years. So there's no time to waste, and we certainly can't afford to wait for the war in Ukraine to end, assuming it does, before arming Taiwan. It's not even, frankly, a prudent bet to wait till we are able to produce all the weapons Ukraine needs and then start adding production for Taiwan on the back end, assuming that takes many years into the back half of this decade, especially if you consider the fact that Taiwan needs many of these things early to build stockpiles, to train, to field, and do all the other things they need to convert, frankly, equipment into a credible defense. So sequencing, not a very good option. And that leaves the fourth and best option, which is as simple as it is difficult in practice. The United States must prioritize. Practical terms, this could look like the following. First, I would argue the United States should urgently strengthen deterrence by denial against China, not only by investing in U.S. forces, but by prioritizing arming Taiwan ahead of Ukraine in cases where they both need the same weapons. At the same time, Washington must do everything in its power to push Taiwan to do more to defend itself. Taiwan has to take its defense seriously, or no amount of U.S. support is going to be enough. I should note that Americans are increasingly weary of war. Taiwan is not very clearly committed to its defense. It becomes that much harder to convince Americans to send their sons and daughters to fight on Taiwan's behalf. I'll also make the point. This is something that's increasingly salient, that the United States is less likely to intervene. Taiwan fails to invest in its defenses, and as a result, U.S. policymakers conclude that it is no longer possible to defend Taiwan at all. So that's the first piece with regard to China. Second, the United States can and should continue to strongly support Israel's right and responsibility to defend itself. All of the reasons that Brad, I think, very elegantly shared, including by providing Israel with weapons that it needs. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, there's very little overlap between Israeli and Taiwanese requirements for U.S. military aid. So that will make it a lot easier to do this, even as we work to urgently strengthen deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. And finally, our NATO allies must take the lead in supporting Ukraine's defense. They're starting to do so. I speak to the Europeans regularly and keep an eye on this. They're starting to do more of that, as it has become obvious that the United States will not be able to continue sending aid at such high rates as we have. That's good, and we should continue to strongly incentivize them to do so. In the process, we can help to ensure that Ukraine has the steady supply of weapons that it needs to deny further Russian advances, seize back any more of its territory, and ultimately compel Moscow to end the war, even as the United States focuses its own scarce resources on deterring China, supporting Israel. I would point out that the United States can and should still send aid to Ukraine if it has the votes in Congress, but not at the expense of deterring China or supporting Israel's defense, both of which, frankly, are more important for American interests. Finally, the United States must reform and revitalize our own defense industrial base. And this is something that's been hit on plenty. Bottom line, if we want to avoid these kind of trade-offs in the future, that's how you do it. It's also important for us to be able to empower frontline states to defend themselves as a factor of deterrence and burden sharing. Got just a couple seconds here left, so I'll close by acknowledging the very, very, very difficult position we find ourselves in today. Europe and the Middle East at war increasingly likely in the Indo-Pacific. The United States has interests at stake in all these places, but doesn't have the resources required to defend all of them at the same time, especially not in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Confronted with this reality, I understand the desire to dismiss or minimize trade-offs, whether by saying they don't exist or that we've got enough time to do one thing and then go to the other. I'd offer only that that is exactly what we've been doing for the last decade and more. Constantly turning a blind eye to Beijing, constantly underestimating the seriousness, the urgency of that threat, while chasing crises in other parts of the world, always telling ourselves that after the next crisis, we will finally focus on China. But we have seen the results. There is always another crisis. Meanwhile, China keeps getting stronger, and now we are truly in a decisive moment. We can finally prioritize deterring China and maybe still avoid war in the Pacific or prevail if deterrence fails, or we can choose not to. In all likelihood, ceding Taiwan to Beijing with all that entails for American interests. That is the choice that I would argue that we are talking about today, to prioritize deterring China or not. Either we will or we won't. The time for half measures has long since passed. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Alex. I think really appreciate the clarity of your positions. And I think those are, and I think you make a very forceful argument for the need for urgency. And I think, regardless of how one assesses the imminence of a potential conflict, which I think is critical to the overall assessment, I think we can all agree that it's no less urgent, to address these issues. And so I appreciate the fact how clear you were about the urgency of the threats that we face. And so I think, we'll get to a point where we'll get to a discussion about the other various factors that you've underscored and highlighted and state positions on that are, I think, important to address. One of the, I think areas that you have highlighted that I think segues well into our final panelist, Yuki's comments. It's about, allies and partners. And I think this is really important here now to bring in Yuki to shed light on how Japan is viewing these ongoing global conflicts and its, and its interest in preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So over to you, Yuki.
All right, thank you, Russell, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, GTI, for giving me this opportunity. I'm very sorry I cannot join you in person, but thankfully we have a virtual option nowadays. So, and then I also would like to thank my preceding three co-panelists for their super insightful perspectives. I know I'm the last woman standing between audience Q&A and a discussion amongst us and itself. So I would keep my remarks short. So as Russell mentioned, I got the assignment to talk about perspective for all this from what does it look like if you're sitting in Tokyo? And I don't live in Tokyo, but I try to replicate that as much as I can. So I think for Japan, one thing right off the bat is Japan does have the enduring interest in ensuring that U.S. strategic interests remain anchored in the Indo-Pacific region, and specifically nowadays, more broadly speaking, East Asia. And the reason is quite simple. Whether Japan likes it or wants it or not, contingencies in the broader Indo-Pacific region, whether that may be South China Sea, unintentional incidents, basically spiraling up to escalate, or whether that might be a crisis in the Taiwan Straits or crisis in Korean Peninsula, Japan will have to be engaged in some fashion of, some shape or form, primarily because of the size of the U.S. forward deployment that Japan hosts across its peninsula. So it is very important for Japan that U.S. remains engaged in this region, and whatever it does have, whatever the action that it takes outside of the region, especially responding to the crisis like Ukraine, like Middle East, does not take away too much of U.S. Interest and focus on its effort to maintain peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. So from that, if I can establish that as a baseline of how Tokyo sees this, currently Japan's concerns a couple of things. I would probably highlight two in particular. One is like I said, because Japan really wants U.S. to remain critically, substantively engaged in the region. What this external threat now in Europe and Middle East, which is basically a two theater active contingency, might affect U.S. the sustainability of a U.S. Interest and backup behavior in the Indo-Pacific region. So basically, U.S. distraction from the situation in the Indo-Pacific and developments in the Pacific is Japan's main concern. And secondary, closely related to that, how it might impact U.S. ability to continue its effort to buttress its presence and its effort to support its allies and partners in Indo-Pacific region in terms of various security cooperation assistance or military assistance. And because we're talking about Taiwan Straits today, Japan is very concerned about how this ongoing discussion about the military aid to Ukraine and nowadays more and more so in Israel could affect U.S. ability to continue to support the Taiwan in terms of its ability to Taiwan's ability to defend itself. And those are like really two main concerns that Japan has. But at the same time, from Japanese broader foreign policy perspective, this is really not about two separate conflicts in the region. It is really about what Japan can do in terms as a supporter of the existing international liberal order. And when the conflict in Ukraine first started, incumbent Prime Minister Kishida's mantra when he have a conversation with the leaders in the Indo-Pacific region is that Ukraine today can be Indo-Pacific tomorrow. And when he was talking about that, he had South China Sea situation in mind specifically. But that really weighs heavy on the Japanese strategic thinkers' mind. And nowadays, though, because we are getting a little bit closer to a 2024 presidential election here in the United States, Japan is paying very close attention to how the election of the presidential election in this country might result into the new administration starting January 2025. It's a strategic security policy and its strategic priorities. And there are a lot of domestic factors that affects those conversations, but I think I will probably save that for a Q&A and this discussion amongst themselves. And I'll yield my time back over to you, Russell.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Yuki. That was really helpful to really help inform us about how these issues may be viewed from Japan, which again is a key security partner for Taiwan and certainly the U.S.-Japan alliance being the cornerstone for prosperity and peace and stability. East Asia is critical to understand the views of Tokyo with regards to these issues. I just want to note for our online viewers as well as those in the audience that we do want to hear from you and have you engage in part of this discussion as well. And so we'll reserve around 15 minutes at the end of today's session, which will conclude at 1:30 to take your questions. And so for our online viewers, remember to send your questions to either to contact@globaltaiwan.org. Make sure to mention your name as well as your affiliations. Those will be prioritized, as well as, or you may use the chat function on the YouTube page for viewing this event. So let me kick off our conversation a bit and drill in on a point that I thought that Alex made with regards to public opinion that I think is quite interesting with regards to issues related to the support for the defense of Taiwan and other allies and partners. And I would like, and I'm posing this question to all the panelists and want to get your feedback and the pressure on this. Now, President Biden has stated 4 times that he would come to Taiwan's defense militarily if China invaded Taiwan. However, American public opinion on the defense of Taiwan is not as clear as that. Now, according to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which has consistently polled on this issue year over year, since the 80s, it did reach an all-time high in 2021, with 52% of Americans indicating support for the use of troops to defend Taiwan. But this number has been steadily dropping over the past 2 years to 44% in August of 2022. And then according to another Reuters Ipsos poll that was conducted this year in August, now there's probably some differences in methodology that we would have to, that can be parsed out, but that dropped again to 38%. So what do you think accounts for these drops in support, and what implications do they have on the issues of how these global conflicts impact, U.S. support for the defense of allies and partners? I would add, as just further context to this, that a further polling done by Chicago Council on this matter, on this question, that was released in October of this year, did provide support that the war in Ukraine has contributed to declining U.S. support for militarily intervening in other conflicts in the world. I would just quote here from the authors of that study. quote, finds evidence that U.S. involvement in the war between Russia and Ukraine has played a role in American attitudes on foreign policy, from dampening public support for defending U.S. allies and maintaining U.S. military bases abroad to continue financial and military assistance to Kiev. End quote. And so what do you make of this? I mean, how should Taipei? How do you as analysts, as policy as policymakers, people who are recommending policies to policymakers, think about when with this data set that we have? Yeah, Mike, do you want to chime in on this one? I know you've been waiting patiently, just being the first speaker. Mike, do you want to have an opinion on that?
Sure. No, I'll keep it quick so everybody can jump in here. I'd say, so honest answer is I don't know. I would guess that American public opinion is responding to a couple things. So the Biden administration has spent the last year making it very clear it was eager to stabilize U.S.-China relations, looking to put guardrails on the relationship or a floor under the relationship. And so, this emphasis on peace and stability perhaps leads to a less concern about the American public about where things may head with China. Alternatively, it's possible that in the couple of years since 2021, the threat has actually become more real. It's become more urgent, the threat from China to Taiwan, and there has been some response to that as well as fears of conflict become more real, right? And especially in the wake of the Russian invasion of Taiwan. The last thing I'd say is that, I think the most important thing when it comes to public opinion on this question is going to be U.S. presidential leadership on the issue, which we haven't seen in, I would argue, in decades. Yes, President Biden has made those comments in response to questions from reporters, but he's never given a speech in which he talked at length about the importance of Taiwan to American interests. We haven't heard that from the vice president, from the Secretary of State, from the National Security Advisor, et cetera. And so there's an opportunity here for presidential leadership. I think the president can bring the American people along on this question. There's been no effort to do so.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, President Biden has several times said, yes, we would come to Taiwan's aid if Beijing attacks. And then in almost every instance his administration walked that back to align it, right? To align it with longstanding, decades-long bipartisan U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act and the communiques in the memos. And so we can debate the wisdom of the policy of strategic ambiguity or recognizing Taiwan as independent. There's smart people of good faith on both sides of those debates. I think what is clear is Americans don't like free riders. And we also don't like bullies. And we admire, I'm speaking for 30 million Americans, so I have that prerogative of a think tanker. I'm obviously generalizing, but I don't think we like free riders. What I mean by free riders who defend their own home and will expect someone else to come in and defend your home for them. People look back on our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan in different ways. I'm an Afghanistan veteran. I spent a little time there. A lot of people I taught at West Point or people I served with didn't come home to their families, and there's empty chairs at kitchen tables. And some people are injured and carried scars seen and unseen with their lives. I don't talk about these issues casually, but I think we admire partners who spend what they need to spend on defense. And so, I'm watching Taiwan defense spending. And I lay my cards on the table. I think keeping Taiwan free is a core American national security interest. But if Taiwan doesn't spend what it should on defense, you make my case less persuasive as I speak to fellow Americans. So I can't tell for sure. It looks like you're about 2.5%. That's pretty darn good for a democracy. I'd like to see it higher than that. And you'd make me a lot more persuasive to people in Nebraska if you increased your defense spending a little bit. You know what I mean? And I don't want a war in the Taiwan Strait. And so I agree, this is where Alex and I are passionately aligned here. I mean, I've been using the term porcupine since 2020. You know, let's make Taiwan a porcupine. What do I mean? I grew up in rural Southern Oregon. A porcupine is something that looks so horrible that it's an unappealing candidate for consumption by a predator, right? So we want to arm Taiwan so heavily that deterrence does not fail in the Taiwan Strait the way it did in Ukraine. So that our sons and daughters, husbands and wives don't have to go and fight to defend Taiwan. I don't want to ever test that. I don't want any president in the Oval Office, Republican or Democrat, to have to decide whether we send Americans to fight and die in the Taiwan Strait. Most Americans don't realize you're not talking about a few dozen, a few hundred casualties. You're talking about thousands of American dead. Thousands. I don't want that. And by the way, China, talking to you, it would not be good for you either. And obviously it'd be horrible for Taiwan. So we all want to avoid that, right? And so what's the core thing here? What's destabilizing the Taiwan Strait right now? What's destabilizing the Taiwan Strait right now is Beijing's unwillingness to take military aggression off the table. What's the essential US policy position when you boil it all the crud down? When you boil it down, we're saying, hey, we got this one China policy, but we'll figure it out. It should be resolved peacefully at the negotiating table. Beijing, don't try it with aggression. Let's resolve it peacefully at the negotiating table. That's our position. I think that's the moral high ground. But you know what? I don't think Xi Jinping gives a darn about moral high ground. He cares about military power. That's why at our center on military and political power, I'm pushing to deliver all these weapons that Alex and I are talking about as quickly as possible. And I hope before we're done, I go weapon by weapon by weapon and say how Alex is wrong on each. I don't and I have the notes in front of me. If you'll give me that, I'd love to do that. But so I think as someone who never wants to see aggression in the Taiwan Strait, Taiwan, please spend more. Please get your act together on focusing on asymmetrical weapon systems that are going to create dilemmas for Beijing. They're too deliberate, too difficult for them to solve. So they decide to never roll the dice in Taiwan Strait. We need to get busy on pre-positioned stocks. We need to get busy training with Taiwan's military. We need to strengthen U.S. military posture in Japan and throughout the first island chain and the second island chain. We need to look at missile defense in Guam. And we need to make sure our blocking forces and our surge capability, ability to get to Taiwan's aid as quickly as possible, as strong as it can be. The reality is Taiwan will be defeated on its own. Taiwan will be defeated if America can't get there quickly enough or comes too late. And so you have to do all 5 of those things I just said to prevent 26, 27 million, what's the current number in Taiwan, losing 24 million from losing their freedom. You got to do all those and you got to do them now. I agree with Alex's sense of urgency. You don't know, and I don't know when it comes. It could come 1 year from now. It could come from 2027, 2028. The paranoid in me says, let's hustle because we don't know for sure. But I'd like to keep pushing, as we say in the Pentagon, that decision to the right. Each day, Beijing waking up to say, today is not the day because we cannot accomplish our political objectives in Taiwan at acceptable cost. How do you do that? You make Taiwan a porcupine yesterday.
I find a thread here, despite some of the disagreements on policy approaches, definitely, is that bolstering deterrence now is absolutely essential, right? And I think that's something that we can all agree on with regards to these issues. I know you have a 2-finger, Alex. Come on, man. Yeah, go for it.
Well, just an initial question. I think it's an important one, right? Yeah. I think what we are observing now, I think Mike has written a little bit about this. Russell, your recent piece on this was really good as well. We are observing what appears to be evidence that political will, like so many other things, is a scarce resource, right? You spend political capital, if you ask enough of Americans over time, it gets harder to ask more, right? Of the representatives, of the voters themselves. I would say for those from TechRow who may watch this or check this out afterwards, or not now, my impression is that TechRow overestimates the amount of support they're likely to receive from the American people and perhaps the representatives. I say that because, having interacted extensively with Taiwanese officials on that side and interacted very extensively with U.S. officials on this, it appears that their impression of, what kind of support they're likely to receive is over-indexed on the fact that they're interacting primarily or most intensively with Democratic and Republican hawks, who, as we're seeing now with the Ukraine situation, are limited in their ability to dictate terms and push things through over sustain a substantial American reluctance ambivalence or opposition. So all to say, I think they may have more of a problem than they anticipate. And so that has implications, again, if you assume that political will is scarce. Just on the implications piece, one, from an American perspective, if you believe that political will is scarce, if you believe that political will be necessary, not only to go to war with Taiwan, but to stick it out and win it, then you got to husband it, right? You know, we've just gone through 20 years of war in the Middle East. Now we're obviously involved in Ukraine. You know, perhaps caveats notwithstanding, I think American voters are war weary. It comes up in poll after poll after poll. So if you're an American policymaker who wants to, maximize our ability to support a meaningful defense of Taiwan, you should be, I think, thinking in terms of how do you husband that particular resource for when it counts most. On the Taiwanese side, I would say there is a quiet consensus in the American and U.S. government that Taiwan's not serious about its defense. See marginal improvements on a variety of things, and you see all the talking points, all the Taiwan news, headlines and all the rest. And there is progress being made, but it's incremental, and nothing to the degree that it seems likely to really make a difference. A couple exceptions potentially, but they haven't been sustained. So, when I think about from a Taiwanese perspective, what does it mean to grapple with the reality that American will is a scarce commodity? You need more of it as much as possible. It will pay dividends for Taiwan to demonstrably be serious about its defense. Just echoing what Brad said, a couple quick points. One, please stop diminishing the seriousness or urgency of the threat that you face. It is not helpful when Americans who are working this very closely and have a good sense of what's happening or are warning about the urgency, and then Taiwanese officials get up and say, actually, no, we've got like 5-10 years maybe, right? That's happening. It's very frustrating. It makes it harder for us. It just demonstrates a lack of seriousness. I get the politics of it, I get all of that, but they need to rack and stack and decide if that's worth it. Asymmetric defense strategy, again, the time has long since passed when we should be arguing about whether or not Taiwan needs to embrace this and fund it and make it a real thing. They should have done this a long time ago. They're making progress, not nearly enough, not quickly enough. And we're still debating what is an asymmetric. But I mean, this is kind of ridiculous. And again, it doesn't help us help them. It certainly doesn't help them, right? The longer we wait to deploy these things and embrace this kind of strategy, the weaker deterrence becomes over time, increases operational risk to U.S. forces, and the consequences go on. Defense spending, I would foot stomp that as well. I mean, USG has been encouraging Taiwan to spend at least 3% for years. Threats only gotten worse. I mean, it seems to me if I'm a country that's about to get consumed by my neighbor, I would be willing to spend a lot more than 3%. If that's what it took to not get consumed by my neighbor, or ideally to avoid a war in the first place. Americans are going to be thinking the same thing and ask themselves the same question. I'm going to send my son or daughter to go fight for you. You're enjoying a modern society and spending, clearly not enough on defense. Well, how do these things line up? I mean, this is what Taipei has to grapple with. And the final thing, and this is important, I think it is eminently imprudent for Taiwanese officials to continue to link Taiwan's future to the situation in Ukraine. I understand the perceived politics of this, why this is something that certain officials may think is a beneficial thing to do, especially as they're thinking about, building relationships, perhaps generating credit with certain audiences in the U.S. government. But Ukraine, it truly is. I mean, it's obvious, one of the most politically difficult things before the U.S. government today. It is not clear how linking Taiwan to that issue helps Taiwan. It certainly is not clear how in any way suggesting that weapons Taiwan needs should go to Ukraine first will help to convince Americans that Taiwan is serious about its defense. So these are just a few thoughts on what I think is a very important and salient question.
So I think it's a very interesting response, and I think what it highlights, again, just many implications, but the reverberating effects of these global conflicts on, elite thinking, as well as, public opinion in the United States, and then certainly those matter a great deal in our democracies, and how that impacts both Taiwanese perceptions of American public opinion, but how certainly American public opinion on issues with regards to national security and defense of Taiwan as well. And so I think that's salad. Yuki, I want to invite you into this conversation as well as part of maybe kind of turn it a little bit in terms of public opinion in Japan, perhaps, and how you see sort of the issues about Taiwan's defense and and Japanese support for the defense of Taiwan, how that manifests in Japanese public opinion and your observations about Japanese sort of elite thinking on these issues.
Sure. So I think clearly in the last couple of years, there's a sea change, at least amongst the Japanese political leaders, about being less hesitant to discuss contingency in Taiwan Strait as more as the Japan's own national defense issues. Because of the proximity of the geography, that is almost by necessity, it'll become that. But regardless of how conflict starts. But then here again, I think where, we've been talking about a lot about the US responses and how, very useful perspective about how this Biden administration really hasn't really taken time to really articulate the necessity of why US needs to be involved in the Taiwan Strait, potential Taiwan Strait contingency from at the very high level of the government. This is when both Ukraine, onset of a Ukraine conflict and Russia-Ukraine war and this Israel-Hamas conflict began. Many people in the government and outside experts really paid attention to how US responded in a way that, if we all remember, Biden administration really took putting US troops, basically US direct involvement in those conflicts and wars right off the bat at the very early on of the conflict, very, very early on of the things. And that actually was a kind of a discouraging for Japanese for those who are watching this in Japan, because to them, if they do that and elsewhere in Europe and Middle East, is this something that we're likely to see in East Asia as well? So I would just leave it at that for now. But in Japan, on Japan's own perspective of Taiwan Strait, I think there is a growing perception that Taiwan Strait contingency is not really a regional contingency per se, like how oftentimes the Korean Peninsula contingency is perceived of, but it is very much of the Japan's own national defense issue. And Prime Minister Kishida has been discussing it as such. Former Defense Minister Kishi put it that way. Vice Prime Minister also, I think, more recently talked about that as well. So there is a growing kind of consensus in the ruling party in Japan that we need to be articulating this, taking the case to the public more in that context.
Thank you.
Just if I may, a quick smorgasbord response on Japan, with full deference to my co-panelists who know more than I do. And my colleague, retired Mark Montgomery, who's a colleague at FPD, and I have written a lot on this, and he's done amazing work on this. According to unclassified war games, defeating PRC aggression against Taiwan goes much, much better if Japan's involved. Much, much better. Okay. So I told you what happens if Taiwan's alone. That's a given. It's just a matter of time. I talked to you about how U.S. surge and blocking surge forces. You bring Japan into the mix, bringing some of its combat power into the mix in an integrated multilateral sort of way. You make dilemmas for Beijing all the worse, thereby increasing I used to be a military planner, increasing the dilemmas for military planners, making it less likely they launch the aggression in the first place. So we all got domestic politics. Goodness knows we have domestic politics in the United States. You have it in Taiwan, you have it in Japan. But the more we can get to an integrated multilateral strategy of denial that includes Japan, where we're making AUKUS a more reality than talking point sooner rather than later, I'm thinking particularly Pillar 2, but also expediting Pillar 1 of AUKUS, Australia, US, UK, the more we can create a combined deterrent that creates real problems for Beijing and prevents the aggression we're all talking about. As I said earlier, Beijing wants to pick off its weaker neighbors one by one. They want to take everything in a bilateral. We should not let them do that. This is not China versus the United States. This is not China versus Taiwan. This is China versus the rules-based international order. And my goodness, Taiwan, Japan, US have a collective interest in that. On your question on polling, I would just point folks to the Reagan Institute's. They commissioned an independent poll that came out today. I tweeted it on my thread. If you can, my mom and 2 other people follow me on Twitter. But if you find it, I tweeted it there. It actually directly contradicts some of the, what's that saying about polls, right? You can find a poll to say anything, but it's 2,500 US adult citizens polled between late October, early November. I find it's actually very encouraging. I'd say, in the United States, Democrats and Republicans, I worked for 9 years in the US Senate. Democrats and Republicans can't agree that the sky is blue. But if there is one area where there's relative bipartisan consensus at the general level, maybe at least, is on the threat from China. So you see some disparities, 10, 15, 20% disparities on Israel, depending on which party. You see 10, 15, 20% disparities on Ukraine. You see more bipartisan alignment on China. Now, taking that and then saying we're going to be willing to send thousands of Americans to fight and potentially die in Taiwan, that's a whole other different thing. But I would humbly offer that as maybe as a friendly counterpoint that there's some mixed polling. We should be careful to overinterpret any one of them. You asked earlier Beijing's lessons learned. I think Beijing has learned. I don't know what they think, but I suspect they've learned that, wow, I think they'd be surprised by the Biden administration's response to February 24, 22 in Ukraine. I bet they'd be surprised on how, the Obama legacy of provocation premise, we better not give Ukraine javelins because we might provoke Putin. There's a little bit of residue of that in the Biden administration, but by and large, this has been, I would say, I worked for 3 different Republican senators, so I think I give the Biden administration about an A- on supporting Ukraine. Who would have predicted that we've done what attack them? Yeah, it's not the unitary warhead, our unitary warhead. Who would have predicted we provide attack? $44 billion in security assistance. And so I think Beijing's learned, wow, America, at least initially, will put its money where its mouth is in helping defend a beleaguered democracy confronting an unprovoked invasion from an authoritarian bully. But that's a positive lesson that I think decreases the chances of aggression in Taiwan Strait. I also worry that Beijing might have learned, look at that. Every time the Biden administration was deciding, do we send patriots to Ukraine? Do we send attackers? What does Putin do? He rattles out a nuclear saber, right? They do a nuclear test. They talk about their nuclear weapons, right? Remember in the initial stages after February, we were talking about a no-fly zone, a U.S. no-fly. I argued against the no-fly zone, right? I thought that would have been a mistake for the United States. But I could see Beijing just saying, look at that. Putin rattles his nuclear saber. Biden hesitates. He hesitates. Americans hesitate. Rattle the nuclear saber. They don't do a no-fly zone in Ukraine. So, okay, what is Beijing doing right now? They're doing a massive breakout of their nuclear arsenal, building a triad, right? So, if you're a military planner in Beijing, it's not rocket science. Remember about 2027, 2028, you act like you're conducting an exercise, except this time it's not an exercise. And then when Americans are belatedly coming along saying, what do? You rattle that Chinese nuclear saber and say, do you really want to mess with a nuclear armed power? Do you really want thousands of Americans dying when Taipei won't spend 2.5% on their defense?
Okay, Mike, do you want to comment on anything on the nuclear side? I know you've done some writing and thinking about these issues as well, but we can turn it over to audience Q&A if you want to pass.
No, I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, well, now it's time for audience Q&A. Please raise your hand. Also, state your name as well as your affiliation, and wait for the mic, please. Okay. There you go.
My name is Yuko Mukai. I'm a Washington correspondent of Japanese newspaper Yomiuri. Thank you for taking my question. I have 2 points. My first question is, as the panelists mentioned and explained how strongly the United States will engage if the Taiwan contingency happens, but there is a strong skeptical views from the Japanese or Taiwan public. The politicians are very brave, but among conflicts is still there. And as we see, like, ongoing war in Ukraine and Israel, we don't see US boots on the ground. And how can we believe that US will engage if it happens in Asia, especially against China? Is it because we have to believe that's more like China's view is more bipartisan here, or is there any reason to believe that? That's my first point. And the second question is, I know none of you guys are fortune tellers, but I just want to know what's going to happen next year in terms of US, China, Taiwan. It's a tricky year. We have US president's election and Taiwan election, and it's going to be a rough year. And we just saw last year, November, Biden and Xi had a summit in Bali, and they agreed to make the relationship better, but nothing really happened. And like, it eased the tension, but it was temporary. And they just agreed in San Francisco. And but how can we? What's your perception about that? Thank you.
These are questions for the entire panel.
Yeah, I mean,
Anybody-
anybody can answer that.
All right, very well, thanks. Anyone want to take those two questions? For those of you online, Yuki or Mike, any questions about the elections in 2024 and what implications will that have for US-China Taiwan relations, as well as the first question is questions with regards to resolve and skepticism of US support in the face of no sort of military commitments, military boots on the ground in the Middle East or in Ukraine.
I'm happy to speak to the second question.
Okay.
Well, look, we obviously we don't know what the outcome of the Taiwanese presidential election will be. I mean, I think if you're a betting person, you bet that William Lai wins. Based on what we know right now, Beijing won't be happy about that. But I think it's more a continuance of the status quo as far as China's approach cross-strait. Perhaps a difference in degree, but I don't think a difference in kind. So I'd be more, worried about, even more frequent and assertive military exercises. Be worried about even more aggressive sort of political interference. But again, I don't think we're going to see something fundamentally different in the cross-strait relationship than we're seeing right now under Tsai Ing-wen. Obviously, presidential election here next year as well. That likely means no Biden-Xi engagement. We'll see if this effort to put the relationship on a stabler footing lasts. My guess is not, especially once we get into campaign season, where the incentives to act increasingly hawkish are stronger. I'll stop there.
So, Ben?
I would just maybe working backwards briefly. I think we've seen over time that just from a trends perspective, that tensions are rising in the Strait. China's military capabilities are improving, and trends overall favor them. And as that's happened, they've become more bellicose, especially if DPP wins. I think you'd expect that to persist. Frankly, even if the KMT wins, you'd probably still expect that. So I think more of the same, but worse, basically. And then on the first piece, I would just say, thinking about likelihood of U.S. intervention in Taiwan context, I do think it's a question mark. I don't think anyone could be sure. Even frankly, the president won't know until the time comes. And I think just as an analytic matter, you would say that Taiwan's fate in this regard is more important for the United States than Ukraine, right? And so in that sense, it becomes a likelier prospect. And then unlike Israel, which has a robust military and a long, very well-established tradition of defending itself fiercely, the likelihood that Taiwan will be able to do this on its own, to Brad's point, is much more limited. So there's also that much more of an imperative for us to intervene just from an interest-based perspective. But I would say, this last point, nobody should take it for granted, least of all Taiwan, certainly our Japanese friends. And so the best way to cultivate, maximize the likelihood that America will come through, do everything possible to strengthen those forward defenses. So it's clear that these are fighters we're coming to back. as opposed to free riders who Americans may have a lot more concern about?
Yeah, just the first question. There is no guarantee. I'd like to think the US would come to Taiwan's aid because I believe it's in our core national security interest to do so. And I believe that when free people fall under the boot of authoritarian oppression, that's a bad thing for all free people. And so I hope we do, but I don't know what I'm eating for breakfast tomorrow. So I can't tell you what a president's going to do in 2027. So if I'm sitting in Taiwan or Japan, what do I do with that? I spend 3.5% of your on GDP. I'm focused on asymmetrical weapons. I'm doing pre-position stocks. I'm asking for more American military posture. I'm asking for more military exercises, and I'm buying a heck of a lot more weapons ASAP. That's what I'm doing. So we're about to run out of time. You asked for math. I'm about to give you some math. So you said Javelin. The U.S. is expected to provide Taiwan, according to foreign military sales on Javelin. You cited Javelin, you cited in your articles. Sorry, it's just wrong. The U.S. is expected to provide Taiwan all the Javelins it is requested under FMS by the end of 2024. Production is set to double, roughly double over the next few years. You cannot blame Javelin delaying Taiwan on Ukraine. And as we stand up PDA, we're going to be able to have all that ASAP. Stingers, the delivery of Stingers to Taiwan was not delayed by aid to Ukraine. Taiwan is expected to receive all the Stinger missiles it has ordered by 2025, with production capacity is expected to increase by 50% by 2025. TOW missiles, the U.S. is expected to provide Taiwan all the TOW missiles it has ordered by 2024. You cited HIMARS. There may be some tension on HIMARS, I grant you that, but Taiwan is still expected to receive the first 11 HIMARS by 2025 and an additional 18 by 2026, which means Taiwan is set to receive more HIMARS on an expedited timeline than it did before the 2022 Russian invasion. Due to production increases. You talked about ATACMS. We have not provided any unitary ATACMS to Ukraine. Those are the kind that Taiwan said you cannot cite Ukraine for a delay in ATACMS to Taiwan. You talked about Harpoon. The provision of Harpoon launches Ukraine did not impede the delivery of Harpoon coastal defense system missiles to Taiwan. These the launchers that we provided to Ukraine were MacGyvered ship-aids launchers, not purpose-built ground launchers that Taiwan ordered. No Harpoon missiles were transferred from the U.S. to Ukraine, but came from European partners. And the list goes on and on and on. So when you actually do the math, as you said, your assertions don't stand up to scrutiny.
If I may.
I'll let Alice respond to that. Okay, go ahead.
I'm not going to get lost in the specific. I'll say this.
You called for math. I gave you math. Yeah.
So look, there's a time and place for all things. I encourage everybody to read my report on this, and then we'll go back and forth in detail and break it form. But what I'll say is this, and just let's work with the Javelins example here. If your point is that, you send all these things to Ukraine, but Taiwan will get them soon enough. Here's my point. You said a few moments ago that we should be getting all these things as quickly as possible to Taiwan, but you contradict yourself. If we were in fact going to try to get these things as quickly as possible to Taiwan, then wouldn't you have to concede that the Javelins we sent to Ukraine should have gone to Taiwan first, right? Or go down the list, right? And there are, and that's just for things, I think where your premise is there is enough for both. I mean, here's what I would say to you. If your position is there's no trade-offs, and you should agree, if your position is there's no trade-offs, and we should prioritize Taiwan.
That's a strong argument.
Let me finish what I'm saying. If your position is there's no trade-offs, that we do have a scarcity isn't a constraint and we have enough to resource all of them, and that Taiwan is the most important, then you have to concede, I think, that we can and should send these things to Taiwan first. And also, if we do, we'll have enough for everybody. Ukraine will get what it needs too, because under the presumption, scarcity isn't a constraint. So what I would say is this. Last point. I've worked on this in great detail. I've worked on this in great detail. Washington, I've worked with Hawaii, with folks who are actually involved with these programs, are actually defining those requirements, what's needed to meet them over time. And the fact is, that there is very substantial overlap, and that the aid we have provided Ukraine has meaningfully delayed our ability to deliver many of these key capabilities to Taiwan. Will they get them in a few years? Maybe. If production rates increase, if certain other things shake out. I mean, we can talk about PDA, we can talk about all these other things, but the fact is, that's what has happened. That's what continues to happen. And so really, at the end of the day, I think this is a question of whether we are prepared to prioritize Taiwan's defense. You may not want to. That's a defensible position.
They're going to have all their Javelins in the next 2 to 3 months. You do speak up. You do not. Okay,
Gentlemen, I think this is an excellent point for us to be able to maybe set up a good debate on Global Taiwan brief for each of you to really, really go point by point on these issues and really hash this out, because we really want to provide a space for such a constructive conversations about these issues, which are obviously clearly important and urgent for, I think we all agree is urgent for us to address. With that, let me thank Brad, Alex, Yuki, and Mike, all of you for joining us for today's seminar. And again, this is live for everyone to watch and rewatch online. So, please, I think we really touched upon a lot of issues here. And finally, just join me in thanking our panelists for
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.